During the first 7 years of his presidency, Ronald Reagan did not use the word AIDS a single time in a single public speech. It seems unthinkable by contemporary standards that the president of the 80s would not have the dignity to give a single moment to the hundreds of thousands of lives that were being lost by those he was supposed to represent, as lives were being lost by the millions around the world. It seems like something a little bit more medieval. You can sort of imagine Reagan like a feudal lord looking out at his peasants suffering from the Black Plague and turning a blind eye. But what's more interesting than the epidemiological implications of HIV and AIDS to me are the implications that they have socially. The social theorist Susan Sontag said that AIDS is something like a pre-modern experience of illness. And in the ways in which we can imagine this, we have to also think about where we are today. When the World AIDS Campaign thinks of getting to zero not only as a goal, but as a very real possibility. And when we see the slogan getting to zero, we probably think about the issue of access. If everybody in the world has access to things like pre-exposure prophylaxis and antiretrovirals, then we will effectively be able to eradicate AIDS, right? Not quite the case. We also need to be looking at the other part of getting to zero discrimination. And this does not come simply as a positive externality of ensuring that everybody has access to the drugs that they need. This comes with looking at the ways in which this is historically developed and looking at the ways in which we can handle disease in ways that are more healthy within our nations and around the world. In my time at Gallatin, my concentration on the biopolitics of development uses, in large part, Michel Foucault to understand power, as it operates on a systemic level that encourages us to act as bodily actors in one way or another. The ways in which this power is coded operates on the levels from global to molecular. But what's not often realized are the ways in which power are often interconnected. And when we're thinking about something like HIV and AIDS, something that has been cast into my generation as something terrifying, we can see the ways in which looking at these bodies as stigmatized, bodies of HIV and AIDS as waste, is how it comes up in the political discourse. So what I ultimately am interested in looking at is how this understanding of diseased bodies diseases our systems of politics and economics and leads to, at many times, inadvertently discriminatory policy. Growing up in the Bay Area, I heard about AIDS on two hands, the first of which was portraying it as a mysterious gay cancer that was spreading through the neighborhoods of progressive cities in the United States like San Francisco and New York. It turns out that the people who were also fighting the vast amounts of power within medical institutions were also largely gay males, and even more largely white and affluent. But the other way in which we look at disease, and HIV in particular, is in the context of Africa. I put up this slide to remind any potential certain politicians who I'll leave nameless in the audience that Africa is indeed a continent, but also recognizing that the ways in which we regard this as an essentialized body in political discourse, whether as a country or as a continent, not only fails to take into account the diverse range of politics and polities and bodies that exist within the African continent, but also allow us to look at HIV in a way that is dangerous and in a way that doesn't take into consideration the nuances of what's actually happening. When we talk about Africa, it's in broad terms in the West, and this is an uncomfortable issue, but we don't often see it as uncomfortable because it comes through in our casual phrases. I'm sure everyone here has heard a mom, whether in our own lives or on TV, say, "Eat all of your peas, there's a starving child in Africa who would eat them if you don't finish them." That's where this idea of the apocalyptic metaphor comes in. When we see the wasted bodies that are intermingled within our cities, when we think about an entire continent as something that is diseased, especially in a moment of hysteria of HIV and AIDS, it becomes this dangerous other thing that is out of sight, out of mind, and apocalyptic. The first point I brought up was that of famine. The stereotypes that we have of leaders in Africa are those of warlords that don't know what they're doing. That's where war comes in. And when you just add HIV and AIDS into the equation, then you have pestilence and death, allowing for the perfect moment of apocalypse. So how this was handled in a tangible policy route is taking that apocalyptic fervor into its stride and allowing for Western development apparatuses to operate in ways that are underneath these levels of stigma. So the ways in which this operated under the Reagan administration, despite his silence on the AIDS issue in public, were actually operating through channels such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. And just as the continent of Africa was essentialized with one broad stroke, the policy implications of this were also painted with a broad brush. The newly independent post-colonial nations of Africa were given money by the West in the form of structural adjustment loans, loans that were given with severe strings attached that came at a point in which it was acceptable to say, here, you can have this money so long as you develop a deregulated capitalist democracy. And it's a little bit hard when things are decentralized to be able to have a centralized response to the single largest global pandemic of the past centuries. As Jean Komaroff, medical anthropologist, notes, it was a perfect storm. It was the post-colonial moment, it was the moment of the rise of pharmaceuticals, and the end of the Cold War. Everybody in the West wanted to defeat communism at this point, at least that's how the political rhetoric was framed at the time. And as such, it was easy for a lot of these policies to remain unnoticed. But in terms of looking at systemic neoliberalism, we also have to look at this idea of neoliberalism and deregulation and decentralization as it affects the human body within and outside of our borders. There is no more potent of an example potentially to look at than that with that of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, which encouraged youth to just say no to illicit drugs, as if it were really just that easy. In the beginning of the American war on drugs, as Nancy Reagan was one of the horsemen of this apocalyptic moment, she was able to mount a large-scale campaign that had extremely damaging impacts on our nation as a whole for the decades to come. So when it's not so simple, when we look at drugs, whether to just say no, we also have to think about the ones that you're just supposed to say yes to. On the left, we have antiretrovirals, now ubiquitous within the continent of Africa for those who are living with HIV, and it's something that is seen as the vanguard of access. Everybody has antiretrovirals, AIDS will be a thing of the past. And on the right, we have a drug that costs $13,000 a year for anybody who wishes to take it if they do not have health insurance. This drug, pre-exposure prophylaxis, also known as PrEP or its brand name Truvada, is largely being taken by the same affluent gay men who were on the front lines of ACT UP in the 1980s. Simply being able to have the access to this and meaning that your likelihood of contracting HIV is less than 1% is an ability for only the privileged few. And we run the risk by looking at the vast disparity between these, or seeing it as a simple binaristic issue in which we can simply infuse pharmaceutical drugs. If we do that, then we're not actually going to be able to defeat AIDS. We're simply going to distance ourselves farther and farther from each other. So it gets a little murkier from there. Some drugs we're supposed to say no to, some drugs we're supposed to say yes to. And in the neoliberal rise of the pharmaceutical industry, more and more people were prescribed opioid painkillers for mental health issues and a whole host of other issues. However, when people have decreasing access to pharmaceutical opioids, they turn to injectable opioids such as heroin. This is an image from last summer in Austin, Indiana, a small town of less than 2,000 people. And over the course of 2 weeks in Austin, over 150 people were diagnosed positive for HIV. This could have been easily fixed if the people in this town who had begun injecting what were once prescription opioids did not have access to clean syringes and thus caused an epidemic level in their town. So what's really important about this case is looking at the notion of a heroin epidemic, as it's been termed by the New York Times and the media over the last few years. And because there are instances like this in which over 150 people contract HIV, it's now seen as an epidemic. However, what we can't forget is that since the beginning of AIDS in the 1980s, people have been contracting HIV through the injection of drugs such as heroin, But the only difference is that in these instances, they weren't rural white people in Indiana. They were people of color in urban centers who have been needing access to syringe exchange programs for years. So our policy restricting this, so our discriminatory policy is now being opened simply because rural whites are being affected by the same thing. So what we have to look at is when we see people who use drugs as bodies of waste, when we see people who have HIV as bodies of waste, we need to think about what is causing us to term them in those ways and how that is tangibly affecting our policy. So when we turn back to the president who said absolutely nothing, and the first lady who told us to just say no, we can see that this is a little bit more complicated than that. And we have to shift our dialogue, not just saying anything, but we have to say something different. And we have to speak more compassionately on the issue of HIV if we're going to actually eradicate the disease once and for all. I still believe in a world in which we can have zero AIDS, in which we can get to zero, in which we can get to zero discrimination, and in which people can have the access to what they need in order to ensure the health of their bodies. But what we need to do is stop looking at the ways in which bodies of HIV are diseased, and look at the ways in which neoliberalism and other policies have diseased our politics and our economics, and allowed for us to go down a path in which we now have to have the power of language to turn from. So whether it's waste, whether it's apocalypse, whether it's just saying no or yes to drugs, we need to compassionately deal with the bodies tangibly affected by HIV. Thank you.